Welcome to our Wednesday webinar. Here today we're going to be talking about capability building and getting learning programs right. This is a topic that maybe isn't a traditional topic, but it's one that I've found is just as important as every other topic when we talk about building more resilient organizations. I'm Linda Nelson, and I'll be your speaker today. And I sit on several different technical committees with ISO and helping to write standards. And our latest piece of work that we're working on is an organizational resilience standard that should start at the beginning of 2022 and really talking about policy and strategy. And so this webinar today actually helps to support that concept, meaning that capability building and learning programs will be a strategy that needs to be considered. So objective today is to really share, and we're doing a case study with US Bank and with Volvo that will share with you how they have used their capability building efforts to really ensure that they become a learning organization and that their people learn continuously. We should have the recording of the webinar available just like we normally do by Friday. Please feel free to use the questions button. I am on my own today. We have several people out on vacation, so I will take a look at the questions at the end instead of during the webinar. And if you attend at least 35 minutes, you will get a certificate of completion, or attendance, I'm sorry. So I wanted to draw a connection right at the beginning with why it is that we're talking about learning and its relationship to organizational resilience. And so when we look at more resilient organizations and what it is that they do, one of the things that we see is that they have a resilient workforce. And so one of the strategies for building organizational resilience is for you to build a more resilient workforce. And really what this looks like is when you implement systems to increase workforce capacity to handle stress, to increase engagement of your workforce, and of course to manage continuous change. And that capability that comes out of that is the organization is intentionally working to reduce employee stress. And what we're going to be focusing on today is providing opportunities for learning and professional development. We have talked in past webinars this year about managing employee stress. And tied to that, of course, is having a positive work environment. So then when we move to, okay, well, let's look at strategic objectives for achieving this strategy and making sure that we have this capability in place. And so a strategic objective might be that you're going to accelerate learning as an organization. So it's something you're going to focus on as an entire organization. And what you're going to do is promote a mindset of continuous learning that encourages and supports people to adapt and reinvent themselves to meet the shifting needs of the workforce itself and the workplace. In addition, when you accelerate learning and you make people feel that that you're contributing in their own professional development, this helps you to nurture and retain talent. And as part of that, you need to select and develop your leaders to make sure they have a diversity of skills, a diversity of capabilities, knowledge, and experience. And of course, foster that inclusive employee experience, reward and recognize performance, as well as deploy wellness and mentoring programs. So we're going to be focusing today on learning programs and building those capabilities. So I thought we should probably start off with what are we talking about? What do we mean by capability? So the first off, the dictionary says that a capability is the quality or state of being capable. So the base part of that word is capable. Then some of the synonyms are to be able to do something, to be competent, to be equal, fit, good, qualified, suitable. And it also includes things like attributes, such as physical or mental power required for the performance of whatever it is that you're trying to have them do. And lastly, a set of tasks that a person or a system is potentially able to perform. So these would be tied to your skills and then tied to a certain performance level, which is your available capacity. So tied to that, we talked about capable being the base word, but we also have the word ability in here. And so just looking at this idea that you might have the ability to write, but you might not have the ability to write a novel, or the capability, I should say, to write a novel. So here is where the idea of being capable and being able and having the abilities are tied to each other. I also thought we should look at capability building versus capacity building because sometimes people use those as the same terms. So, your capacity are the resources you have to complete a task, and they're tied to having the time, energy, or money to do that. And when we're talking about transformation, capacity building refers to an individual or an organization's ability to absorb change effectively. So, we're looking at this idea of managing change, which of course is a huge theme when we talk about organizational resilience, this idea of adaptability and managing change. And we often see this capacity building when we talk about when organizations are talking about doing a transformation. But one of the things we know is that the pace and scope of changes oftentimes outpace the organization's ability to absorb it. So we need to understand that capacity is sometimes a finite resource. And I believe all of you probably can give examples in your own lives, personally and at work, where you just don't have the capacity. You might be able, you might be capable of doing something, but you just don't have the energy, you just don't have the capacity. I just can't do one more thing right now. And so that's why these two things need to be complementary to each other and considered in comparison with each other. So when we look at capability building, we're specifically looking at skills and knowledge to do a particular thing. And so this is where sometimes an organization might have the capacity to change, but maybe they lack certain capabilities. So these, again, these two concepts are very much intertwined. And so you can build your capability by increasing a team's knowledge and skills, which can actually also help expand your capacity. So that idea of working smarter, not harder, um, because we know that working through change is the new business as usual. It isn't the next big change. It is what's happening today. What is the new change? And so the goal really becomes to manage that pace of change at a speed that matches, your individual employees' rate of assimilation, how well and how quickly can they manage change. And so by building resilience into your organizations, you're actually helping the people that work with you to be able to assimilate change better and to manage change better so that they can renew and grow at a pace that you need it. One of the things that's sometimes missed is that when we build capabilities, we forget about some of the soft skills that go with that. And so oftentimes that's when jobs are awarded based on technical abilities and seniority, sometimes they actually haven't been trained in how to manage. And I'm sure many of you have worked for people who know how to do the work, but they don't know how to manage their people. And all of a sudden they're in a management position and they're at a loss of what to do. And that impacts the quality of the work that's being done as well. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at capability building, we also look at those soft skills. And that's some of what we're going to talk about today. But all of this is tied to the capability of your business or your organization. And so what is your organization's capacity? What is their materials? And what's the expertise does your organization need in order to perform those core functions? And so you'll see that business capabilities and strategy and execution are also tied together. So if we say that a business capability is that set of tasks or activities that a business function of an organization is potentially able to perform, so what are those skills that you have? And then at what level of performance? So what's the available capacity for them to perform those skills? Because we know that your strategy, which are your objectives and your initiatives, require certain capabilities. And so business capabilities really describe what a business does and what it needs to do in response to their defined strategy. And this is where the business capabilities help to close that gap between strategy and execution. We do also know that when your organization focuses on its core capabilities, it gives your company a competitive advantage because this allows you to kind of standardize the context of capabilities that you need. And then you can also outsource some of those things as well because now that you know what they are, you know how to go get them. And this requires you to have a 360-degree view really of your organization and looking at your understanding of that interconnectedness and those overlaps and synergies that you have between these different business functions. And this is really, really important when you start considering how to decrease silos and some of those sorts of things. But your business capabilities should really lie at the top layer of your business architecture itself. They should be very stable. You shouldn't be changing your business capabilities unless you're changing, what it is, your core vision and purpose of what your organization is doing. And this makes strategy much more tangible to deal with. And if you've defined them well, it really helps reduce those silos. So this is what's called a business capability map. And we are not actually going to spend any time on this today, but I wanted you to understand that everything that we're learning today would be tied to something like this as an outcome. So when you're looking at your business strategies, what are your goals and objectives? So you might have 3 or 4 goals, whatever they are. And then what business capabilities are they reliant upon? And then you drill down deeper and you look at what are the processes that are needed? What kinds of technology systems do you need? What information are you dependent on? And then who holds that information? And who holds those individual capabilities and competencies? And so this is people or companies oftentimes do a what's called a business capability study when they're trying to put maybe a new strategy in place, or they might have new competitors and they're trying to identify where they need to grow. It also helps you to develop, so it's kind of an HR thing as well as an executive thing, where looking at here's our current capabilities in terms of skills and capacity, but here's where we're trying to go to. And so what are the gaps that we have, if any? And then really having a very good understanding of what your partners and suppliers, what knowledge you have, your technology systems and training that you have that you need in order to develop that business capability. And for those of you that are business continuity people, here is where I would think that you could be looking at, here's another place that we can look at our data. And like if you're doing a business impact analysis, maybe you start looking at your business capabilities as part of that. One of the things I have tried to do in each of these webinars is to draw connectedness between what your current job role is and how you can expand that. And one of the things I feel is hugely important is data and analytics and making your data and the knowledge that you have relevant to top management so they understand what it is and they understand how what it is that you're doing contributes to the overall organization. And so, looking even at business capability mapping as part of your business continuity and crisis management strategy might prove to be very helpful to you. And so this is just, like I said, an example of something that might help you in the long run. But what I really want to focus on today is how do you make your organization an intentional learning organization? And this is an outcome of every organizational resilience study and what makes organizations more or less resilient. And this idea of you need to be a learning organization. So at the base of it, you need to then support intentional learning. And this is actually something I hadn't really thought much about, is that learning itself is a skill. And I may have mentioned, if you know me in the past, I was a high school teacher. And so I've spent most of my professional life early on being an educator across many different ages and trying to help kids to learn how to learn. But I never even simplified it to think that learning is a skill. It's something that can be learned. And therefore, it is something that we need to teach people. Even in the professional world, people may not feel that they have that they are smart enough to. People might say things like, "I'm just not good at learning." Well, in other aspects, then let's become better at learning. And so, how can you unlock their mindsets and their skills to help them boost their personal and professional lives? Because when your people are performing, your company will profit from that as a competitive advantage. And we know that the pandemic has heightened the urgency of doubling down on the skill building, either to keep up with the speed of transformation that's currently underway, or to really just manage the particulars of working in new ways. I think all of us have been very aware that we have had to learn a lot in this past period of time, and that maybe that learning has been different than what we have done before. So when we look at mindsets, you might see that you have two kinds of people in your organization. One of them might be that fixed mindset. And ironically, I tend to think of this as being those older people like myself, that just say, I you are who you are. And you heard people say is this is just who I am. This is what I do, and I'm going to continue to do this. And you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Whatever words that people use, they generally tend to be, I'm stereotyping here, but generally tend to be older people who maybe just don't see that they need to continue learning. But I would hope that more of you are in what have what's called a growth mindset, where you see every experience as an opportunity to develop and grow. Um, and so here is where, when we're looking at who you hire and how you cultivate learning in your organization, you need to have an understanding of who your people are, because a fixed mindset really stunts learning, because it tends to say that you can't change, you can't improve. This is just something you're born with. This is the way you are. They see themselves as either intelligent or average, but almost everybody says that they're intelligent. I think if you interview people or survey people, everybody thinks that they're very smart, but they might not think that they need to change. And that really is the crux of it. We need people who see intelligence and capability as not fixed points, but traits and skills that you can improve on. And it also helps to build in this idea that learning means that and trying new things means that you may make mistakes. And having this growth mindset as an organization itself releases your people from this expectation that they have to be perfect. And so when they fail at something or they make a mistake, it isn't saying that that they're just not smart enough to do it, but it just might mean that at that particular time, they didn't have the resources or tools that they needed to be successful, which then gets to the second half of the conversation, which is what is it do you need to be successful? And a growth mindset in an organization itself liberates your people to be able to find, value and joy and success in the process itself rather than just looking at the outcome. And so this idea that learning is a skill, but it's also a process. And I think one of the things we've said, like if you're writing a crisis management plan or you're putting together a project, um, the actual writing of it is where the learning takes place. And therefore, the using of it becomes secondary because you've learned it by creating it. And so it also gets tied to just the educational experience itself, which is that experiential learning versus just having somebody tell you what to do. You're experiencing it yourself, and therefore you'll remember it better than if you just read about it or have somebody tell you about it. I do love this picture. This is a quote by Albert Einstein, and I think it's, we often think about Albert Einstein as being, this brilliant person who's made all of these, he's done all of these fabulous things, and he's really changed how people think about the world. But his quote that I think is so fabulous is that I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And curiosity really becomes the cornerstone for all intentional learners. And understanding that each of us can become an intentional learner. And I just say it's not as hard as it sounds. It's really tied to being curious about what's next or what could be. And so we need to build on that fundamental skill. But in order to do that, we need to create a culture of intentional learning. And just like everything else, our leadership plays a critical role in fostering that culture that allows learning to flourish. Um, it, Leadership and culture, of course, we talk oftentimes in organizational resilience about how they are what holds everything else together. And so here is one more way that leaders play a critical role. They need to, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in the case study as well, but they need to model and teach intentional learning practices. And they found that leaders who value curiosity and learning have teams that value those things too. So, to build an intentional learning culture, you must visibly invest meaningful time in your own development. So, as a leader in your organization, you need to invest meaningful time in your own development as well. And let go of this idea that the leader is the expert and embrace the idea of the leader as the learner. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that all of our references today come from McKinsey. And this is very unusual, but when we did the research on intentional learning, learning culture, capability building, they just had the best work. And so you'll see in the series of references, I would strongly encourage you after here when you can view the slides again, that you take a look at the references, and we will include the references with your certificate as well. But leaders also need to make high quality learning and development planning part of your culture and processes. So in order to, if you're going to emphasize the need for intentional learning, you need to create space for it. In everyday, it means you have to give time for it in the job. And obviously, you guys are on, and this might be part of your lunch or it might be part of your evening, depending on what time zone you're in. But you are taking time to learn during your work time, and companies need to do that as well. And so, whether it's on the job mentoring or coaching or feedback conversations, whatever it is, you need to provide specific learning times that are part of your day to day work and not make people do it as extra time. And that means you need to be aware of your mixed messages. We know that intentional learning cultures thrive when the words of leaders match their actions. But, have you ever been sent to a training and then when you come back, your boss is complaining about all the increased workload your absence created? Or, your boss has promoted this idea of curiosity, but then says you have to do things exactly this particular way. So just, you have to be really aware of mixed messaging and that you're following with actions of what you're saying. But you also need to be careful not to spoon feed. So you need to encourage and empower your people to grow, encourage yourself to grow. And this means you need to provide opportunities and access to experts. But at the other side of it is everybody's responsible for their own learning. So I'll challenge each of you to be personally accountable for directing your own development as well and not expecting your company to do it for you, but to drive that in your own organization to be able to take advantage of learning opportunities and to share what it is that you need. And I think what we're seeing a lot with the younger people that are coming, if you work in an organization that's hired, people in their 20s, the expectation is that they're going to continue learning at work and that work is going to provide that opportunity. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day who was looking for a job, and like many people are right now, and she actually made that part of her interview process of the companies that she was interviewing with is what are my opportunities for growth? What are my opportunities for learning? These are the things I would like to grow, how I would like to grow professionally. How would that fit in to what your organization has? And how would you help support me in my personal learning um, journey? So back to learning as a skill. And if learning is a skill, this means you can learn new skills. And there's just a couple of quotes from an interview that they did here that I thought were interesting. Um, Elizabeth Young McNally says that one of the fundamental lessons she learned at West Point was you have to really learn to follow in order to learn how to lead. And so she was sharing how this was really a deliberate approach in terms of how to become a leader and how to actually become a follower too, because you need to be able to take directions. Not everybody's going to be the top dog. Matthew Smith says that there's a huge role that organizations play in setting the context and culture for learning. It's like so many things, but like I just mentioned, it starts at the top and starts with having a CEO, or senior leader who actually values learning and talks about it very actively. But then they found that 90% of companies believe they're going to have some sort of meaningful skills gap over the coming years, but only 16% of them um, feel prepared to actually do something about that. That's a huge gap. And this idea that you need to build that sense of adaptability in your organization within each of the individuals that you're hiring and teach people how to be more adaptable and to feel more comfortable with change, because adaptability is a skill set that you're going to need to cultivate, and it's not going to go away. It's going to be something that becomes more and more important to you. But also understand that a learning culture requires a long-term growth orientation. So you need to cultivate this growth mindset. You're not going to get your money back right away for it. So some of the ways that you can do that is to use storytelling and role modeling by having senior leaders share how learning and long-term perspectives are important. Another friend of mine works for a company that their CEO each week, I don't remember when it is, it's like 10 o'clock on a Tuesday or something, um, sends out an email with either something that he's learned in the past week, something that he found that was interesting, or just something to share about his own personal journey as a leader of that organization and what he has found that he believes that others in his company might benefit from. And sometimes he tells stories about things that happened in the past to him as a younger person going through his career cycle. So this role modeling and storytelling is hugely important, but it also requires an investment of money and time and resources. Learning, whether it's in learning programs or whether you're reskilling people, and you need to be really explicit in the expectations of time spent on learning. Some companies have implemented policies where they say that 10% of each week you need to be spending time on learning. So how are you spending your time? And this kind of goes back to this driving a culture and a language of learning by at the end of each meeting or as you're working through a project, saying things like, what are we missing? How can we consider how to do this differently? Excuse me. And so here is where you can be bringing these things up all the time as part of what you're doing so that you become this learning organization. But in order to do that, you have to have a culture that where people feel psychologically safe to share their ideas. And that's a big deal. And this is really tied totally to your culture. So you need to identify the most critical soft skills that will drive your business value. And it's strongly encouraged that your company start hiring for adaptability. And I'm sorry, it looks like there's a typo there. So that you understand completely that you're looking for people who can manage change and are adaptable and that can move along with you as your organization changes. And so setting that expectation that people are required to take time out to learn, and then building learning into your employer expectations by making it part of your review process. So I'm sure many of you have this in place already, but what's your learning and development plan over the next couple of months? And we've talked in past webinars about hopefully the annual performance review is being supplemented by regular conversations. But here is where, if you hear of something and now that you think might benefit you in whatever project or program that you're working on, being able to take advantage of that because it's part of the expectations that you're going to be doing that. You need to hire people who have that growth mindset and have a willingness to embrace new perspectives and new skills. And then as an organization, ensure that your learning and development spend is tied to your strategic objectives. So here is where everything should be tied to your strategic objectives and the strategy of the organization. So where you're focusing your learning and development and your reskilling and all of those things should be tied to that as well. So this is a interview, and it was actually a recorded interview where they documented the text. And so I would encourage you to actually listen to the interview. There's so much content in here that I feel like it's a learning piece all in itself. And I actually don't know. I didn't know who Tim Walsh was, so I'm not promoting U.S. Bank or anything like that. I just felt that his answers to the questions that were posed to him in this interview were really helpful. And so the topic of the interview was capability building and how to have a learning culture in your organization. And he really started off with this statement. I'm apologizing ahead of time that the next few slides are very text um, full. And so I don't like to fill slides with a lot of text, but I was trying to pick out what I felt was really great things that he was saying, and he said a really lot of great things. So, but again, I didn't include everything, so it would be worth your while to take a look at that. But he starts out by saying it's tempting for leaders to imagine they can achieve their business objectives by simply setting the strategic direction and guide your people that way. But in a world that's rapidly changing, you can only keep moving in the right direction if the people's skills and capabilities evolve simultaneously. And so here is that direct tie to change and managing change in your organization and how you have to then support your own people to be able to tie into that. So he says if you don't get capability building right, you can't get strategy right. And it's essential as any tool a company has for achieving its strategy. And we've talked in the past about the importance of everybody understanding the organization's vision and purpose. And so this idea, an environment of mission, purpose, and individual generosity is central to building capabilities that achieve strategic outcomes. And understanding that when you purposely invest in human capabilities, which is a strategic priority for their bank, and the importance of executives serving as those role models. So what you're seeing is we talked about theory a few minutes ago, and now we're talking about how leaders are actually implementing some of that theory. So he says you need to start with a clear understanding of what your organization is trying to accomplish, and then look at that from a learning and development perspective. And then look at developing that mindset, which is then rooted in your mission, which is wanting your people to invest their hearts and minds to empower human capital, human potential. And he gave a story, he talked about how they're doing this in their individual banks and how they've changed customer service from what it was pre-COVID to during COVID to what they're looking at post-COVID, and how they're seeing relationship building at the bank coming back to be as part of their customer service piece, which I think a lot of people complain about banks is that, you just get an audio message and you never get to talk to a real person. And so as part of this, you need to create an environment where each and every person can thrive and where they feel that they're at the top of their game and that they're bringing their best self to the table. And to do this, as we mentioned before, they need to feel psychologically safe. They need to feel that they're trusted, and they need to trust the people around them, which again helps them to bring their whole self to work and be exactly who they are without fear of being criticized. And this is the kind of environment or culture that you need to have in place, um, because then they're going to want to get better at those specific skills that are required for their jobs. And then understanding that they can make a mistake because it's part of their learning process and they won't be punished for making a mistake. If you make the same mistake over and over again, that's a different story. But we're talking about making mistakes as part of learning. So you need people who want to continually learn and grow. And you also need to be able to help them to learn to be more effective leaders. We want to have an organization that's filled with leaders. And so what are the core skills that they can do to help become better leaders? And we do have, ICOR has education and webinars. And I believe there's a blog or two about, building more effective leaders throughout your organization. But they also need to understand why learning matters, that we're not just doing this for the sake of learning. Of course, I am someone who loves learning, so I would say that's an outcome in itself. But, as an organization, you're doing it because the external environment's evolving. Your customers' expectations are rising and changing, and you have to be able to respond strategically. So therefore, how can we do that? And then when it comes down to, people working for your organization, they need to be tied to your purpose and mission. And so their own feelings about contributing to an organization need to be tied together. And this is where, getting your human potential by getting your people to invest not just their minds, but their hearts as well in your organization, you've got to be a learning organization to do that. So, of course, the role of senior executives is pivotal. And so, a couple of examples of what they've seen done at US Bank is he says he talks about why learning matters all the time in virtually every form and conversation he has. He says he describes his own personal learning journey. He talks about his own strengths and the challenges that he's faced in his career, and he encourages others to do the same thing. He says he also takes classes or courses because the belief is that everyone needs to participate in learning programs. Learning's not just for other people, so we all need to take courses and help design them. So here he is, the vice chairman at the bank, and he's taking classes to learn more. And this is another example that he gave is that a very seasoned, I would say that would be considered older, senior executive, he or she stood up in a meeting of 150 people and announced, I guess it is a he, that he spent the weekend on a course on analytics because he didn't know much about it. He wanted to learn more about it. He knew that analytics was playing a larger and larger role in the organization. And so he figured he better learn something about it. This is a huge signal to people that they should be acting the same way, whether they do it on their weekends or whether they do it during work time, is a different question. But this idea that everyone in the organization should be learning. And so one of the things that they did at US Bank is They instituted a concept, what they call strength-based development, and they put everybody through a program and they encourage people to understand and consciously use and build their strengths to be their best selves. And so the premise here was that everyone needs to know who we are, and it's important for your leaders to understand the strengths of the people around us too. I want to just diverge from this just for a second before I go on and say that. So I was a special education teacher, so I was teaching kids who were not very successful at learning. For them, it was a skill that was very, very difficult, dependent on that learning, and it was very dependent on the learning environment. And so one of the things I kept asking is, well, why don't we teach them the way that they best learn? So let's identify, instead of in the era when I was teaching, it was we need to build up their weaknesses. We need to get their weaknesses up to where everybody else is, or to strengthen their weaknesses. And instead, my suggestion was, and I'm sure I'm not the first person that said this, but let's figure out how these kids best learn, and each one of them is going to be learning differently, and teach them in the way that they learn. And so this is really the premise that they're following at US Bank is, what are the strengths of our people? What are our strengths? And then that ties into what are our strengths in our organization? And how can we utilize those strengths to help us move forward and meet our strategy? And how can we also identify what our gaps are so that when we're hiring or when we're doing capability building or learning, sending people out to learn, that we're actually helping them in ways that they can improve some of their weaknesses as well. But one of the things that they did was a test called the Strength Finder, and the intention here was that you'd find out who your best self was, and this was just before the pandemic hit. And what he did is he introduced his entire team by talking about what was special about each person and what he saw as their best selves. And I can't even imagine having someone in senior management talking about individual people and what they're really good at and what he appreciates about them. That is a hugely empowering place to be. And so when he kind of concludes with saying we have to focus on mission and vision, but using that as a spirit of generosity and recognizing everyone's strengths and then continually reinforcing those. Because capability building never ends, it's an ongoing task. And when he hears people saying, I didn't think we could do that, but we did. And I'm sure lots of you have said the same thing, that if you had if you could look back 2 years or 18 months and think about where you were then and what you have actually, where you've gone in this past time and say, I never would have dreamt I could have done that. Those are stories that we need to share. And those are indicators that your organization is also creating an environment where everyone can thrive. So it's about building human relationships, it's about powering human potential. And what they're seeing is that they're measuring attrition rates, both as customers as well as employees. So they're seeing this as a long term, like I said earlier, it's a long term investment, it's a capital investment. And they're seeing that if they're better at their customer service, their customers won't leave. And if people are excited to work at US Bank, they're not going to leave and go work somewhere else. So you need to make purposeful investments in your people. And this is really part of the key factor in capability building. And we know that, you know, you can use capability building as a strategic weapon by keeping your people in line with some of the changes, because change is happening and I don't see that this is going to slow down. No matter how long somebody's been with your organization, there's always that next horizon of learning and what's important for them, not just to stay current, but even to be getting ahead of things. And so if you can be talking about everyone in your company's personal learning journey, that becomes of their professional development and who they are and how they work within that organization. And so it really becomes critical for every employee to have a personalized learning journey. Just kind of like I was talking about with the special education is, we might not all learn in the same way or have all the same learning needs. And so what does it mean for each individual to be able to leverage their strengths and to become better at what they do? And this is going to build that sense of personal growth. And so when we talk about what makes people stay at companies, it's when they feel that when people are engaged, and people are engaged in your company when they feel that they're personally growing. Then they don't need to look outside the organization, because your approach should be one about excitement for their career development. and learning new skills and new knowledge that'll help them to be more productive and more successful in their career path. And so when organizations intentionally invest in their people grow, not only their skills, but they also grow in that personal fulfillment and engagement, which then means that they're actually performing better because happy people perform better. And this, of course, increases that overall sense of happiness and their loyalty to the organization. And so when you're looking at your employee engagement, employee satisfaction surveys, what they're seeing is that they have when people sense their own personal growth, they're much happier at their organization, and so they see that in the actual test results. Just a reminder again that this is a long-term investment. It is going to have an impact on your performance, but it might not be from today to tomorrow. This may take. It's a strategic weapon, and so you need to make a purposeful investment in it, and think about it as more of a capital investment in the human capital of your organization. That this is something that's capitalized and depreciated because those investments that you're making now can enable your employees to adopt new skills for the future needs of your company. So consider the investments you're making as a multi-year investment return. I was talking to a friend of mine that actually just left or is in the process of leaving a company, and she gave her notice. And um, the, and the reason she was leaving was not the job; it was the company. It was the culture of the company. And the very thing back that they said to her supervisor was, "See, you invested money in her learning, and now she leaves us." And, if they'd asked her, she would have said, "I'm not leaving because you didn't provide me with professional development opportunities. I'm leaving because you didn't value what the work that I was bringing back from those things, and you didn't want to make any of the changes that you sent me to learn about." So this is where, that your payout of the performance shift can be several years down the road, but it has to be tied to a culture that is encouraging learning and growth. And so here is where we start looking at well-being being part of a skill. That's a skill that you should practice. And so as we mentioned, they're going to be more productive at work. So it's just like you're cultivating things like communications skills or leadership or problem solving. We know that with technology in our lives 24/7, and the expectation is sometimes that you're supposed to be working all the time. And so just to take care of yourself as well, and for companies to say, whatever your work hours are, that's when you work. Otherwise, you need to protect your own physical and mental health and make sure that you have a clear sense of purpose and you don't let other people's priorities take over yours. And so this whole idea of well-being is becoming more and more prevalent. And so this is something where companies need to consider as well as part of this. So just a couple of common mistakes. If you don't tie your learning programs and capability building programs to expected performance improvement, you're not just investing in your people so they can go out and learn things that aren't relevant. They need to be relevant to what their performance is for either their current job or a future job. And so you need to be very clear about what are you expecting people to do. So let's say you train some people on how to do agile project management. Well, you would expect them to now use agile project management on their new projects and not going back to the way that they were doing things before. Also, spending too much time in a traditional classroom context. Traditional learning, and here we are. ICOR is a learning organization, and we have, been having to conform to a lot of what people wanted, which is they want a classroom, they want in person. Well, you come for a few days or a week or something, and this is kind of maybe the traditional model that IBM used to use years and years ago, where you'd get hired and then you'd go off for like 6 months to learn the IBM way, and you actually weren't doing anything. They were just investing in your learning. What they're saying now is that you need to make sure that what your learning programs are tied to your day-to-day job. And so we know that virtual programs work. And in fact, they sometimes work better because they're more flexible. So sometimes people need to travel, for that in-person experience, and that travel isn't available, or the time zone thing becomes problematic. And so now that organizations have been learning virtually, I don't think that's going to go away either. There's always a place for in-person, but I think we're going to see it gradually being replaced by a lot more virtual. So one of the most important things you need to do is understand the role between your business, between your capability building and your business value, because that's why you're there. You're not just throwing money at things. You're trying to drive business value. And so look at it when you're talking about, capital budgeting and all of those things in your investments. What's a percentage of revenues you're plowing back into your workforce? Do you actually have an amount that you're doing? What they're saying is with talent continuing and more so even becoming a differentiator for companies in their performance, um, you need to invest in your people. And then what kind of effectiveness are you getting out of that? So things like you need to help people become more resilient, become more adaptable. Obviously, topical training, but also including things like executive coaching and a whole other things that can make your workforce a lot more effective. Because capability building and learning should be a CEO agenda item. It should be part of what they're doing. And developing talent, of course, is part of what every organization should be doing. And so you need to invest in value creating capabilities. And so looking at this idea that capability building and financial performance are linked together. So you need to have the right people with the right skills in the right places to help promote that operational efficiency, customer satisfaction, and whatever other elements are in place that feed the sales and revenues and profits and any other measures that you use for your organization's performance. And back to Tim Walsh, so you're going to have to look for markers along the way that make you feel comfortable that you're moving in the right direction. And these markers of success, or what are your criteria that you're measuring against, might be an increase in the number and quality of customer engagements. So, how many people are your customer service people talking to? And what are getting higher employee satisfaction scores, things like that. And all of those things then should point to those more tangible measures of sales and growth and all that kind of thing. They're talking about the next 10 years bringing fundamental changes to our working world. I think that it's shorter than that, and that each of us is going to need to continue acquiring new skills to be able to meet these changes. And COVID certainly has accelerated these changes. This study by McKinsey is a year old. They do this study annually, but it's not that old, and I think it's still relevant and shows some of the gaps. And so, looking at some of the results from this, I think will be helpful to us. The crisis is not over in most countries. It's still going on, and the demands have continued. And so, how are we going to prepare them for that? And so when we're looking at what are the capabilities that companies are targeting, they're looking at improving leadership skills, helping people to be more resilient in personally, and also helping them to be more adaptable, manage change better. So when they looked at capability building before COVID, they 59% thought it was very or extremely important to their long-term growth. At 59% of them had that, and now currently they've moved that to 78%. So you're seeing this becoming a much more um, obvious or cognizant of the fact that they're going to need to continue to upskill and reskill their people. That most companies do place a very high value on learning. Um, and they understand that they need to be a learning culture. They may not be actually doing it, but they understand that they need to be doing it. And this is where are they spending their money? And so 53% companies are spending their capability building money and their learning money on reskilling and building the skills of their existing employees. And then you've got 6% moving to contracting, 20% maybe shifting people to new roles in the organization, and then another 20% looking at who they can hire to fill some of those gaps. One of the things that they found is that between March and November, um, people felt that they were spending more time on learning rather than less. We all had to learn new things, and so 41% of them said that they're actually spending more time on learning than they were before the pandemic. But still, there's still a lot of companies that had either decreased or reduced the amount of money that they invested in learning. Only 34% said that they increased at all. And so I guess I can understand that because if you're having a crisis and there's lots of things happening, maybe just keeping the status quo was what all they could handle. And so I'm not trying to be critical of this result. What I'm saying is that when you have a crisis, and if you're not managing, you're not in a position, depending on what industry you're in and how badly you were impacted, having no change might actually be a really positive thing. And so when they looked at what capabilities they wanted to develop within their people, we're back to that same thing: leadership, the ability to aspire others, and resilience and adaptability. So we're seeing this repeated over time as well. But one of the things that they're saying is that only 33% saw that their capability programs were achieving a business impact, and maybe that's because some of the long-term investment themselves, or maybe they're not doing the right things. And so this is an area where everybody needs to improve. You need to be able to show how what you're doing is impacting the business in a positive way for it to continue to be done. And this might actually be one of the reasons why. So these are the gaps between executives' current roles in capability building and the roles that people actually want them to play. So supporting participation, they say ideally is at 59%, but in this case, currently they're at 64%. So perhaps the COVID piece actually helped companies to focus on individuals a little bit. But then creating opportunities, actually, there's a big gap between what they would like at 58 and what they're seeing right now at 40. There's also a big gap at linking the learning priorities to business outcomes. Remember what we said at the very beginning, your value of what you're doing needs to be tied to your business outcome. That's why you're there. You're in business to succeed. And so everything that you're teaching and becoming a learning organization needs to be tied to supporting those learning objectives. And to that being a gap of 24 is a big deal. And also participating in programs as experts or trainers. When we saw that modeling, with Tim Walsh was sharing that modeling becomes very important, and having your leaders participate themselves is hugely important, and there's a big gap there as well. So this might be why we see some of those gaps. So when you're rethinking capability building, you have to have a plan for where you want to go. And what we see here on the bottom right quadrant is that 45% say they don't have a clear plan for building high priority capabilities. Well, if you don't have a plan, you're probably not going to achieve much either. So having a plan is important. And so, 34% have a targeted set of capabilities that they're building on. And then another 16% are working on it. And then you've got 6% that don't know. So my guess is that there's nothing happening there if you don't know. And so what should you be teaching? Well, I'm going back to that IBM model, in the past, is teaching them the business. How do we make money? What's kind of our business as usual model, and how are we trying to transform? And what are the kinds of things that we're trying to do in the future? And then talk about how do we run the organization. So you're talking about management, and here is kind of the culture piece comes in here as well. Whether it's your structure, your operating model, your governance, whatever it is, this is how we want you to operate. And then making sure everybody understands how they add value. So here is that connection. When people have that personal connection to how the organization makes money and how they contribute to that, they then feel that their work has value. So what are the jobs that you need to do with business as usual? What are the jobs that you need to do during a crisis or during a transformation? And are there any roles that might be changing for that? So what are those technical and functional skills that you need? And then how you want people to behave. So here is where you can develop your people as colleagues and as leaders, and looking at their mindset and modifying their mindset, as well as teaching them how to be more agile and adaptive and that sort of thing. So this is, back to the talent development. So whether your organization calls it, human resources or talent development, it needs to be done systematically. And so looking at identifying the skills that you need now and in the future, and then working with those people in talent development to map those skills to those strategic and operating plans. And this is just a very basic picture of putting together some kind of a skills matrix that outlines those key roles and responsibilities that are relevant and where you have your gaps. And this is where, during performance reviews, for example, you can talk about new skills and mindsets that are going to be required, and what kind of investments that you're going to need. And is this something that you're interested in learning more about and becoming stronger on? Which means we need to get back to people. And one of the observations that's been made is that organizations have become very much tied to processes and people are having process fatigue. And this has been especially obvious in the past time. So we have kind of dumbed things down and using processes to replace creativity and innovation. And if we do that, we're going to lose talent and it's not going to help you with that um, resilient workforce strategy. And so the other thing that's happened is that HR has had more demands by the employees on what it is that the company is supposed to be doing to support them. So when we look at the role of HR, we really need to make sure that they understand who we are and being very clear about the organization's why, what, and how, why it exists, what it does, and how it runs, and how we operate. We've talked over and over again about being as flat as you can, and then figuring out how it is that you can grow. This last little case study is about capability building at Volvo, and it's in the EMA region. And his comment, Bjorn Anwal, says that we're learning more and more that the only way to truly build strong capabilities is by doing the hard work. You build capabilities while building the future. You don't do it in a classroom or on the side. So what are the core competencies that we'll need in 5 to 10 years looking forward? And as a builder of cars, the technology and the changes in cars has totally changed. Even the selling of cars has changed over the past 18 months. And so how do we start planting the seeds for those competencies today that we're going to need in the future? And this is something that needs to be intentionally done ahead of time, not after it's too late and it's already happening, because you need to be able to drive change and be part of the transformation versus being trying to catch up. And so as part of this, you need leaders who can work more cross-functionally and who can get different domains and competencies areas working together towards that same goal. So this is where we talk about being as flat as possible, having matrix and other sorts of teams that are cross-functional to get people to work together. And so you have it, especially at Volvo, where you're talking about a lot of manufacturing, people learn by doing. And so here is where they also use long-term competency journeys, and they're trying to institutionalize their learning by doing programs and emphasizing those individual career paths or journeys. And so here is where he says he has a hard time separating a good capability building program from a well-orchestrated careers. And so how can employees at every level get exposure to different areas of the business? And this is what he sees as the future of competency development. So and new people coming in want to know opportunities to learn, and they want to have an impact at the company early on. And so you need to orchestrate those opportunities so that they stay engaged and help you succeed in the future. So to summarize, we need this by role modeling. We see that when senior leaders role model the behavior changes they're asking employees to make, those transformations are 5.3 times more likely to be successful. You also need widespread employee engagements. You need at least 25% of the people to be part of that change. And you need to consider your learning environment and looking at virtual delivery as something that is not going away, and how can you utilize that for the best learning possible. Because we know that companies with capability building programs in their transformations make greater improvements in their organizational health. And this is from McKinsey. They do their organizational health index, and so this is where they get their scores from this. When you have more than 30% of the employees engaged, your score goes from 12 to 46. It's a huge difference. They also have better returns to stakeholders. So again, greater than 30% has a 43% return, or whatever the points are here, versus a 9. And so the question really becomes, how will your team fare in the future of work? So develop a perspective now on the realities of your workforce, and where will those human beings be in 5 to 10 years, and how can you help them take the next step forward? Because you want them to, if you have good people, you want them to stay with your company. If you have people that don't want to learn and change, you don't want them to stay with you. So that this needs to be a candid conversation. So just kind of in summarizing, there's a lot of McKinsey references, like I said, and we'll share that with you with your certificate. We do have to make a change in our September webinar. We did this schedule back in October and November of last year. And since then, I am now speaking at the DRJ conference in Phoenix, and they put my presentation on the last day on September 22nd. So instead, we'll be having a guest speaker from C4CS talk about effective scenario-based crisis communication training. And we don't have that registration open. This actually just happened yesterday. So we'll have that registration open hopefully this week. Please contact us. We'd love to stay in touch. And I do think there was a question. So give me 1 minute to. The first question, was will the presentation itself be shared? And so this is where you can log in to the website, and not log in, just go to the webinar page of the website, and you should be able to view it. We actually don't make it downloadable, but you can view it as often as you'd like. So the last question was, how do we strike the right balance between the encouragement of employees' learning and incentives around it on one side, and the need to ensure the return on investment at a relatively shorter term perspective for business survival? And that really becomes the question. And this is why looking at this concept that it is human capital, it's a long-term investment, and that management really needs to understand that. But if you're looking for short-term things, then you're looking at more of the skills-based of what skills do we need right now. If you're talking about the softer skills, those are going to take more time. And so what do we need right now and what do we need in the future is really becomes the core of that. And that's why that capability mapping and the skills mapping really becomes part of not just something that top management does, but every leader in every part of the organization looking at your team and where are your strengths and weaknesses? How can you build on those strengths? How can we close some of those weakness gaps becomes really important to be able to show, some short to medium term value. So thank you for your time today and have a great rest of your week.